So let's look at the functions and the systems in my Sam Curious Cars app. We've defined what a button is, and I'll go back to the Sam Curious Cars app. I will start with the drag racer car, which uses a button and two motors. Let's go into it. So I've just started the drag racer game, and it's asking me to turn on my button. So I've got my button, I'm just turning it on, and as soon as it turns on, it shows back up and connects to my interface. The interface is asking me to use a little controller for this exercise, and it's now asking me to grab my chassis inside of my kit and also to add two motors onto my chassis. So I've turned on my two motors, and I can see on the interface that they're connecting. After they've connected, I've been told how to add the two wheels to the motors, and here we have a trick. It's the extruding part of the motor of the wheel that fits into the motor shaft. It's a D shaft, and I'm just adding them to my chassis. Over here, that's one, and I'll grab the second motor now. And the wheels fit nicely in as soon as we actually get it through that entrance and that D entrance. Now that they're in, I go to the next step, and it's asking me to add the little caster ball to my car. So I've got my car, I've got my controller, and I'll bring the screen down so we can see what's actually happening. So here on the interface and on the table, we see a similar thing. We've got on the interface the button inside of the controller and the car, but nothing's happening when I press on my button. That's because they're not yet connected. To connect the button in my controller to the two motors on my chassis, all I need to do is draw a line between them. So now I've got my button that's ready to go, and I've unlocked the first function. So whenever I've pressed on the button, the car just goes. I can let my class play with this for about a minute, and quite quickly they will just say, well, the car's just going forwards, how do I make it turn? But before that, we need to take a step back, bring the attention back after a countdown technique, and go back to the whiteboard to see and analyze what was happening. So I'll take a quick screenshot of our system here, and let's start analyzing it. So we've got a system called the drag racer, and I'm just going to highlight it by drawing a square. And so here we've got a drag racer, and I'm just putting an acronym, drag racer. I can put it here as well if I want to, drag racer. And I'm going to highlight what are the sensors and the actuators, or the inputs and the outputs. Let's just call it inputs and outputs for now. We've got one button as an input, and we've got two motors as outputs. Perfect. We also have a governing function, and that function, I'm choosing the color blue, is to go. So if I want to tie everything together, I can say that, well, we've got a button as an input connecting to the two motors. Let's draw a diagram to show what are the inputs and the outputs, and let's create a framework that we can always go back to. So I'm saving this picture, and I'm going to my notes. Inside of my notes, what I want to do is get to a diagram that looks like this. All right, so I'll start it from scratch just for illustration. I'm selecting everything, and I will delete it. There you go. Now I'm choosing a new canvas, and I will start enumerating basically what we did. So what we had is we had a system called a drag racer. So let's use the acronym DR for drag racer, and we will also say how many inputs we had in the system. We had just the button. So the diagram for the button is this. This is a button, and we had two outputs. So here, let's just say out times 2. And I'm going to draw diagrams for two motors that I've come up with. Now we've got a button, two motors, and we had one governing system, or one system that was basically doing, in which everything was sitting, the inputs and the functions. And also choosing the color blue, we had one function. That function was to go. So here we've got the go function with a little sign, and this is the first function that we have. So we've outlined what the system was and how it was working. Now, what we can also see is the students will quickly say, well, the car is just moving in one direction, it gets stuck. How do I unstuck it, or how do I steer it? Well, it's a good point. It's a good time to start with the next level. So I go back to my Sam Space app, I press finish, and I go to the next challenge called Zombie Birds, the minigame. That challenge is asking me to grab a new block. That's a SAM slider. So I grab it in my kit, and I also ask the students to find it in their kits. Divide it into groups of 2 and 3. They just turn it on, and as soon as it's turned on, it's recognized on the interface. And I tell the students, okay, you've got 1 minute, I'm counting, to get the highest score on this game. And so we get the whole student class engaged with this game, and they can start getting the best score possible on this game of Pong. The important thing is that they interact again and have fun with these sliders and these pieces of electronics. Soon after 1 minute, we count down, we ask all the students to put their block back on the table, and then we'll analyze. Okay, we ask, was it behaving exactly like a button? Well, was it an input? Was it an output? Let's go back to our little system of defining what the blocks are. So we had the button explained. Let's do the same thing for the slider now. I'm going to grab a pen, I'll use the color black, and so I'll say slider, which is what we're using now. So we've got the slider, and the diagram for the slider is a rectangle with a line in the middle and another line. So is it an input or is it an output? Well, since we had something happening on the interface after we're using the slider in real life, it means it's an input. So let's define the type as an input. What kind of value did it have? Was it exactly the same thing as the button, whereas when I was just pressing it had only one of 2 values? Not exactly. It had a range of values, which was more than just 2. So we can say that it has a range. We can even say that it has a range between 0 and 100. All right? Or we can say, if we want to simplify the language, it had many values, implying more than 2. And then context. Where do we find dimmers or sliders in real life? I've already given you the answer. We find sliders in dimmers when we want to dim the light. We find sliders when we want to control the volume. So here I'll just say volume. We find slider when we want to control the temperature on a thermostat. So let's say thermostat. So we've defined a slider, we've defined what it is, and maybe it's time now, after a discussion with the students, to see how it's implemented as part of SAM inside of the SAM Curious Cars app and inside of another vehicle.